So, Praveen, uh, tell us a little bit about who you are and what's important to you in the world.
Yeah, thanks for now. I'm Praveen Mantena. I'm a leadership executive coach. I work with organizations in all kinds of contexts, primarily with leadership teams. And I am obsessed and fascinated by systems, particularly what are the systems in which your organization is working, the visible and invisible systems, what kind of changes are happening in the systems, what is the larger context of the world that we're working in, how we're affected by it, how we're impacted by it, how we are impacting it, and just starting to unfold the whole thing. So it's like a Mobius strip that just keeps going down further and deeper as we look at it. So that's what I'm here to talk about and what I love to talk about.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
And I am Renelle, and I founded Insight Coaching and Consulting about 15 years ago after working in large firms, large consulting firms, as well as United Way, and really starting to see, oh, wow, all the system and organizational shift we do is so dependent on the deep shifts that humans make. And so I started down the path after having my own executive coach of adding leadership coaching into the mix of how do we do the deep work as leaders in order to really shift the systems that we're part of, the work systems, the communities, society, et cetera. So Praveen and I have a lot in common in that way. And we could talk about a myriad of things, but today, Praveen, what are we here to focus on?
Well, I think we should take a look at essentially spiral dynamics, which is a map and a model that organizes a culture, group of people, set of behaviors, values, principles into colors and tiers. And each one has certain advantages and certain ways of looking at the world, and also certain disadvantages or certain limitations in how they see the world. I think that'll be helpful because it'll help people assess as leaders where they are. And again, we won't go into every single detail of the spiral. We're going to link some references to it for people to look further. But I think it'll really help leaders assess where they are, where they're going next, and what might help them integrate.
Right? Yeah, I think that's great.
Where they're stuck. Yeah.
And spiral dynamics then was taken and put into a business context by Frederick Laloux in a book and a series of now people have taken and do a lot with his work called Reinventing Organizations. And so there is this way of how do we take our worldviews and then shift our organizations. And I think that there's a whole way that over time we've gotten here, but I know Praveen and I have some great discussions about some of the more evolving ways of being that we would that are important for as the world shifts and leaders shift, that our organizations and other systems need to shift as well. So shall we take a shot at talking to our audience about some of these things that are really exciting and important to us?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna let you start. I trust. I always love where Praveen starts our conversations.
Okay, great. So we're not going to go, like I said, we're not going to go really deep into the model. We are going to link some references for you to have some basics of the model. So we're going to proceed here with a little bit of assumption, like you've looked through the model and have some understanding, but we'll touch on some reference points, yeah? And so when we look at a leader or a leadership team or organization, what is the current system and set of principles in which they're operating? And I think most people will be surprised, maybe even shocked to realize that most of it falls into a certain map based on human evolution and systems changes over time and where cultures have proceeded over time. Yeah. And I think what would be really fascinating for us to look at is two particular components of this map, which I think, Renelle, probably you and I find is most of the organizations that we work with fall into this. Now, again, there's also variances, but I think it'll be really helpful to start to look at orange and look at green and talk about why you and I are such big advocates for the next step up from there, which is the color teal, sometimes called second tier as well. And what are the ways in which we actually encourage, nudge, and usher people towards some of those principles onto the second tier and how that can happen, and also the ways in which people can typically fall into pitfalls with that as well too.
I love that. And so if we start with orange, orange is where we would say, and we'll explain it a little bit, is probably where most organizations are operating from today. And at one time when we shifted, say, into the Industrial Revolution, it was where we needed to go as humans, because it allowed more people to do different things than what they were born into. However, it's also a bit known as the metaphor as a machine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like to say the real roots of orange started actually with philosophy. So if you look at the writings of Descartes, the French philosopher, he was really obsessed with reducing things down to essential elements. And so if you look at so much of how modernization and industry works, is simplify, reduce to its basic components, replicate, commodify, optimize, produce, scale, standardize, so on and so forth, right? So essentially, it allowed us to create the world we have right now with all the conveniences, appliances, technology, scaling, the population that we have. So a lot of good things have come out of Orange, which is inputs into the machine, outputs from the machine, and how do we continue to optimize it, lower cost, make better products, standardize quality, so on and so forth. Brilliant, amazing. Really the crowning achievement in a lot of ways you could say of Western civilization of the last couple of 100 years.
Right. And it's also where a meritocracy came from, meaning that, if I was born a baker, it doesn't mean I have to be a baker my entire life. And so it was a major breakthrough. And as we've gotten a little bit more complex and this society has evolved and the need for more than just treating humans as machines, what have been the downfalls of orange?
Well, the problem is that the world is actually not a machine. Turns out that the world is a very complex ecosystem with high levels of interdependency and nuance, and things have worked a certain way that goes far beyond the machine analogy. And so essentially the metaphor of a machine is it'll use something up until it is used up without a lot of regard for the longer term consequences or the impact on the larger system. And so essentially we have a planet right now, because of industrialization, we're finding more and more that the entire ecosystem of the planet is breaking down. And Orange does a poor job of accounting for that, actually.
Right. And so then this next evolution, and there's always this thing of transcend and include. So there's still things that we want to take with us from how Orange has served us. But this part that the breakdown that Praveen that you're talking about is a little bit where what we call green came from. It has a metaphor of a family, which has there's wonderful things about that and downfalls about that. But green brought in the element of people, and it's kind of where where we started seeing values come into organizations, and et cetera. So talk a little bit from your perspective about that. The downfalls of Orange helped us come into green.
Yeah, absolutely. And green has been around for a while, but we would say probably that it really came into its own sometime after World War II. And so if you think about World War II, and I'll speak specifically to the context of America, in the 50s, after the war, you had the GI Bill. And so everyone suddenly had the American dream. Everyone's buying a home. Everyone's got a washing machine, refrigerator. And we were sort of hitting like the peak of Orange in a way with capitalism, modernity, and the lifestyle. And then you have a whole generation that came from that period, World War II onwards. Now we call them the boomer generation. And they essentially came of age in the 60s. And they looked at the empty heart of the American dream. And they said, this is bullshit. There's a lot of problems with this whole thing. And so it's the cliche of the really, really bored suburban housewife who has this nice little cul-de-sac home and all of her appliances, and she's just completely going crazy with how empty it all feels, right? The dream actually is at its heart, empty dream. And so from there came a lot of values of like, we want peace, we want expression, we want freedom, we want care for all people. And we're not buying into the American capitalist dream. It's a dead end. There's more to life than this. And from there, all the counter-revolutionary ideas as well, too, which also ties into what was happening with the civil rights movement as well, too, during that time. And so there were a whole bunch of movements that came together. And similar things were starting to happen in Europe as well, too. So in the 70s, we have a whole movement called sociocracy as well that was starting to begin at that point as well, too. And so the foundations of green, which are very intact still today and continue to grow, is how can we look at what's happening to the planet? and the impact on the planet, the natural ecosystem. How can we have true equality for all people, regardless of background, identity, origin, race, abilities, or lack of abilities, and so on and so forth? How can we take care of everyone? And ultimately as well, too, how can we have more of a shared distribution of power? So power doesn't lie in traditional institutions or only who are perceived to be the smartest, the most powerful people, or the people with the most money, but how do we have the distribution of power and rights for everyone?
We start to bring in the helpful, almost the rational and logical side of orange, and we start to balance that out with the people, the heart, the emotion. So it's like, great. Like this is it. This is it. We're figuring it out. And what are we learning as we've progressed, as we continue to progress and try to bring green into society and organizations? What are we learning from that? What are the good parts and what are the downfalls?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what you just said, both humanism and Earth, much more of an Earth-centric perspective, reintegrating some indigenous perspectives as well too, long needed. Looking, nowadays in the modern movement, looking at all the impacts of, we use words like colonization, patriarchy, systems of oppression that have been there. It's time to make it all visible and finding a new way forward that works for all, right? Essentially, not just for a select group of people who are in a privileged position. So those are the positive impacts of green. Of course, it's gotten a lot of pushback as well too. But you won't go into it for this conversation. That's a whole separate topic. And there's also unfortunately some real limitations in the system of green. And so one of the things that green has done is in its pursuit of equalizing power is it's actually ended up turning power into a shadow, into a sort of denial of power. And in its attempt to flatten everything, including hierarchy and structure and create equality, sometimes you can end up creating a real dysfunctional, like typically I find with green organizations when I work, there's almost a dysfunction around how to make decisions, who's in charge, who has power, who has authority, and who doesn't, because all voices want to be included. And it gets confused between equal say or expression versus equal power.
Right, exactly. And it's not only happening in organizations, but you can see like an element of it in small groups getting together. You can see an element of it in some meetings that you may be in the community where there's like analysis paralysis because we're not making decisions because we're trying so hard to get consensus. And then we also water down amazing ideas in our quest for everyone to be heard because we start to mistake I want everyone to be heard. And I also want to be able to step into my own zone of genius and power because there's a light side of power as well. It's not all shadow. And step into that and be able to move things forward without disregard to what others are saying, and also not watering down amazing ideas because of the need to make sure that it's 100% equal. But what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully. Exactly. So power, decision-making, authority, while taking people's perspectives or needs into consideration and bringing it back to an individual or bringing it back to a very small group of people, not the whole collective. So that's where green can start to stumble on that. And there could be all kinds of power dynamics going on where people are trying to grab power sideways, essentially, rather than just trust the authority with the power. And so that's some of what happens in green. The other thing that happens with green, and this is happening at a more global level, but it's also happening in our country, in our polarization, green is still stuck in the us versus them, which means here's my values. Here's my values. Here's the language I want everyone to use. Here's the beliefs I want everyone to have. And here's what I believe is right and progressive, or here's what I believe is wrong and regressive or even evil. And if you don't adhere to my values the way I would like, then you are not with me, you are against me, and you must be pointed out, you must be blamed, you are turned into the devil, or at the very least, you're going to be canceled, essentially. And I'm not referring to like real crimes, criminal behaviors, or physical harm caused to people and things like that. So I'm not trying to trivialize it, but it goes into a moral philosophical level too, where two people who are generally good people can get into essentially very much a polarized context that are within green or not within green, because it's still operating from us. You're either with us or you're against this paradigm.
Yes.
And so what it's missing is the ability to hold at both end. There's a great organization called the Institute of Belonging and Othering in Berkeley, a guy named John Powell, where he talks about how important it is to create belonging and how easy it is to create othering in that process.
I love that you bring that up, because we see, I mean, I would imagine everyone listening could name a couple of areas where we see the downfall of green, of either how we're performing in green ourselves or what's going on around us. I know that I've watched, especially during COVID, I've watched people whom I love very much, two people, completely almost destroy a relationship because of their beliefs and values seeming so different. And where I could see as an observer, it's always easier as an observer, right? Where I could see where both of them were right in some ways and both of them were wrong. And I could easily see a middle ground, but they couldn't see it. And so at that point, there was no both and. And so there's this other place, and there's so much more we could talk about in all of this, which maybe we'll have a series, Praveen. But there is an evolutionary, like kind of the next evolution that starts to address the downfalls of green and transcend what is really great about green into what we call evolutionary organizations, from reinventing organizations, and also Teal, that comes both from spiral dynamics and reinventing organizations. So do you want to transition us there?
Yeah, let's move there. And so first I'll say this is that Teal is still, unfortunately, relatively uncommon.
Right.
It's uncommon within leaders. It's uncommon within organizations. And it's not because the principles are necessarily that hard to understand. There's even a comic book version of Reinventing Organization that most people I've given it to read it go, oh, this is amazing. This sounds wonderful. It's a little trickier to implement in practice. And so part of, the phrase that Ken Wilber popularized, which is transcend and include, in some ways, I think it actually has it backwards. I actually say first you have to include and then you can transcend. And I think the inclusion part is difficult because you can't really go to Teal, for example, say if you're in green and you've rejected orange, like you're repulsed by capitalism, for example, or systems of productivity or labor or any of those things. Like if you just are investment money, if you're repulsed by all of that, you're probably not going to do really well in Teal.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're going to be stuck in green. Yeah.
Right. So I think we've done an okay job of explaining, hopefully, to all of you, kind of the concept of orange and green. And so Teal brings in this both and. What does that mean? And also, Praveen, if it makes sense, I love when you talk about our relationship with power and how important that is for us to be able to transition. We have to transition internally as a human before our organizations and systems can transcend.
Yeah. So power is a really interesting topic. Yeah, because it brings up a lot. So it's right up there. And in a lot of ways, spiral dynamics essentially is a spiral on power, because it's always asking the question, where does power lie? And in the spiral, we're going from individual to collective, sort of like a DNA strand, going back and forth, individual, collective. And so orange, the power is an individual. If you're really smart, you work really hard, you're really dedicated, you're brilliant, you're innovative, you'll rise to the top, right? From the mailroom to the boardroom, so to speak. In green, power lies in the collective. So if you are able to hold values that take care of a larger group of people, take their needs into consideration, create equality for them, represent them well, you're going to be powerful, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously look after the larger interest of whatever system you're working with, including the planet. Now with Teal, you actually go back to the individual because that's how the spiral works. And the power goes back to the individual. And so if you're coming from a collective only perspective, then you're going to maybe find that a little bit challenging to realize that. But if you have an integrated green and orange, then you will not have a challenge with it so much. You'll actually get it. And so when we go back to Teal, essentially what we're saying is you want to bring individual power back, individual purpose, individual passion, individual calling that takes in the needs of a much larger system and also individual beliefs. So, for example, what's it like for you and I, Renel, or for any leader to sit in a discussion for a topic that's really controversial or for which half the room is divided, even polarized, and be able to hold a larger context and a perspective on it, starting with themselves as an individual, as a leader.
Right.
So they're not trying to just pick one side that they can represent that will still be green to share that collective perspective, or they're not just trying to see what's in it for them and how they can use the situation for their own advantage to rise and improve their career. That would be orange, right?
Yep.
But how can they actually represent something maybe that's not even being talked about by both groups, that is a larger emergence, that's a synthesis of what's emerging here and creates a whole new perspective one way forward? That would be teal.
And sometimes we can call that the third way. We can call that both and. Frederick Laloux in Reinventing Organizations describes it with 3 components: self-management, evolutionary purpose, and I'm missing one.
Emergence.
And
holism.
Like operating with your whole self. And so you put those 3 together and it's exactly, Praveen, what you're talking about. But what happens is I've worked with a lot of organizations because we're always all moving towards teal. We're never going to say we're this color, we're that color, but we might just be starting from different places. And I've watched organizations say that's not teal. And right there, we can tell that we're not anywhere close to that when we're trying to name it. I've also
the teal that can be named is not the teal.
Exactly. I've also watched people, just circle in consensus thinking that, okay, we never move on until everyone is happy. And that's not it either. And we also don't say, okay, I've had enough of this. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. We hold both. Yes, I have listened and I have heard you, and I'm taking accountability, whether this goes well or not. That's the thing. I'm taking accountability both ways, and I'm going to hold the system. I'm going to hold what you said, and I'm going to move forward in a way that feels right. And if my decision I make doesn't go well, I'm also going to take accountability for it.
Yeah, well said. And that's where teal starts to eventually move beyond green, which tends to drag down into sometimes the denominator of who's most traumatized, upset, or triggered in the room sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And teal essentially saying, because I've put in more work on this area, I care more about this area, I've done more due diligence on this area, and I'm taking responsibility for this area, I'm also going to take the power, authority, and decision-making with it while taking everyone's input into consideration, essentially. And so it then proceeds from there, and it does that. But here's the thing about it. It's still based on there's still a sharing of power, because somebody else or some small group of people can do the exact same thing for something they care about a lot and want to take decision-making authority on. And so it starts to spread it into areas. And so it essentially creates these little mini cells of decision-making authority that's then getting input from a larger system and still continuing to make decisions from it. So it's almost like, there's a great book called Team of Teams, about what happened in Iraq War and how the U.S. military had to essentially jump from blue to teal. Here I had a chance to read that, from this really hierarchical structure to something where people have a lot of autonomy and able to take feedback from the system and make a lot of decisions, sometimes even on an individual level, to respond. Because that was the only way they were actually able to deal with what was happening in Iraq with the terrorist cells, which were actually operating that way. And the U.S. military was not able to keep up with its whole structure with that.
That's so interesting. Well, and you say the other thing, I just wrote an article comparing Ford versus Ferrari, but talking about the self-management. And so when you say lots of different, ways start to formulate, I can already hear someone asking that how does an organization not become complete chaos? And that's where this larger purpose and guiding principles, they become more than just something that's written on the wall, right? They become a living organism that, okay, I can take a small group and we can do something creative and innovative. And this is where both and comes from. We know that we want to stay within the guidance and vision of the bigger principles of the particular system that we're operating in.
Exactly. Well said. It's also, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And so you could have an overall structure, which in an organization, even that maybe is somewhat traditional, or it could be fairly modern, it's a little bit more flattened. But then specific sections of the organization could start to operate in Teal on their own, which means they have more autonomy. The principles in which to operate are more Teal. There's more self-management going on. And so I love to see Teal, particularly not necessarily like an entire, I know they have been organizations that have tried it. For example, Zappos, famous example with Holacracy. And the verdict has been mixed. Yeah, so this is still something that's emerging. So I don't want to present Teal as if you've got it all figured out. Just follow this and you're going to save the world and everything's going to be perfect. That would be blatantly false and a fantasy. But the principles of Teal, which are still emerging and relatively recent, and we're only talking the last couple of decades that people have started to use these principles, maybe as old as the 70s with sociocracy being the beginning of it, and it was mostly philosophical back then, is when all of this started. But it's a step in the right direction. And it's a step even something like the U.S. military now has been forced to look at and move towards post-Iraq, essentially, in its principles. And so
kind of one of our most green or even before, not green, sorry, one of our most orange or even before institutions that needed to shift based upon the evolution that's happening in our world.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the places I love to look at this, so people, particularly naturalists, will talk a lot about this. And so when you look at old school naturalism, everything is about systems and hierarchy and which branch of the family you belong to. It's this very structured, linear way of looking at the natural world. But now, obviously, we have a more sophisticated way in which we view how this planet works and how everything is interdependent, but also everything is very autonomous. And so if you watch actually creatures in a habitat and how they operate with a lot of autonomy, but also a lot of interdependency and awareness of the whole system at large. And it creates a coherence and a balance within a natural system that we can only dream about in our organizations. And so we're starting to pull some of those and starting to implement it. It's a little clunky. We're finding our way there, but it is the only way actually forward, unless we're going to continue staying what doesn't work.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're doing experiments. I know, one thing, and then we'll end and maybe we'll have another series here is, one thing, this one little thing that we've done in organizations is sometimes we'll just have that an empty chair in a circle or in the meeting. And what it does is the empty chair represents a lot of times the organization itself, or it could be something else. And so it's just a reminder to look at that empty chair and say, okay, we've all given our input. What do you think the organization has to say about this? And it's just a great reminder that just sits there, and it almost helps to embody that our organizations are not machines. Our organizations are ecosystems.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a stakeholder. We could put one for our community, could have literal representation of the community. We could put one for the biosphere, the planet, depending on what industry we're in, if there's impact there, and often there is. What does it have to say? How do we take its needs into consideration? So we're starting to expand our circles of awareness, our stakeholders, and that can easily get complicated and complex with all the differing needs that can happen, So an organization that's trying to cut costs, lower overhead, and have more positive impact on the environment. Now, how is that going to work? That's where things get really interesting. And I don't believe we can actually get there with green and orange structures. We can only get there with teal structures.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And then just to come back full circle, is that's where this individual deep development and shift and the consciousness of an individual themselves and the expansion of that becomes so important, because the more of us that are doing that deep work as just humans and as leaders, then the more we can start to shift these systems, because it takes each of us doing our work in order to do this collective work. Okay, Praveen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed this. We will look to do some more, and we really, those of you that are listening, love to hear your thoughts, your questions, what confused you, what excited you. And thank you, Praveen. I love having these conversations with you. And instead of just doing them hiking and having them with each other, we decided we'd start to share them.